The Winnipeg Jets have held their end of season wrap up reviews and interviews, and guess what? Some interesting insights came out from both the players and staff. Find out what they said on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. But of course, more than anything, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, I want to spend some time talking about today's wrap-up interviews and press conferences from the Jets. I think we heard a lot of different things from both the players and coaching staff, and some of it is really worth sitting down and unpacking because there's a lot of interesting feedback. Some of it you're not going to love. Some of it's pretty decent. Some of it gives me hope for the future, and I think it gives me a lot more optimism about next season than I think some may have right now. Obviously, the Avs series might leave a huge sour taste in your mouth, but I'm going to be honest, these past 2 years were kind of a transition point for this franchise. I think the Jets basically pushed as far as they could get with their current roster and the current core. But now it's time for what you might say a pivot point, right? A move to the future. And I think the Jets are about to start that process if any of the comments are anything to go by. Before we start off with Coach Rick Bowness and what he said about his take on the playoffs and his future, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. The fast-paced game lets you team up with friends or tournaments to unlock awesome prizes like unique stickers for trading, cool playing pieces, hilarious emojis to taunt your friends, and more. Download Monopoly Go free on the Google Play or App Store. As always, game on. Now, like I said, Bowness gave his comments today, and honestly, if you haven't heard them, they're worth checking out for a couple of reasons. I think the biggest takeaway that I had from what Rick said was that he's probably going to step aside at the end of the season and not continue coaching. I think that's the general vibe I got, and there was some feedback from him during the press conference where he said he wants to stay involved, but he didn't necessarily indicate how. He didn't say that he's going to stop coaching or anything, but like when asked about his future, something that he immediately mentioned and referred to was talking to his family and his loved ones and wife. And I think that to me sounded a lot like he's perhaps thinking of stepping away from the bench. And I've said this for a while that in his case, he's had such a long career. He's been with all of these teams. And when his wife had her medical issue and when he had his own procedure, for me, it just felt like, there's just more important things in life. And I think if this is like the final season from him as a head coach in the NHL, I don't think it's something that, I think he can go out with his head held high. He's had some really amazing playoff runs with teams. He's been one of the longest tenured coaches out there, from having been a player and all of this stuff into his actual NHL career as a head coach. I think this was not the worst way for his career to end. He's basically accomplished everything, and he even said this, he's accomplished a lot of what he came in to do for the Jets. And the biggest thing was really restore the vibes, get this team back on track, help them kind of through a really rough transition period and put them in a better place than he left it. And certainly the tactical side of things wasn't great. I think that there were some big questions about his, talent and roster lineup assessments and stuff. But at the end of the day, right, what he was brought in to do was to redirect the Jets in the right direction, point them north, I guess, get them back in good standing. And you know what? He's done that. We started selling out games again. The Jets were fun. They had a huge, second seed in the Central Division. They had a season that I think a lot of people will remember, a Vezina winner. Arguably a Hart Trophy finalist, although I don't know if he'll actually get enough votes for that. Hellebuyck, I think, can probably be happy with at least just 2 trophies, a Jennings Trophy, and of course, his upcoming Vezina. So in a lot of ways, this year was generally a success, and last year, at least on paper, was probably a success. Did either season end the way that I think you wanted it to? Absolutely not. But I will say that at the end of all of it, I think he ended up succeeding in what the Jets wanted him to do from the start. And so, if this is how his coaching career ends, I think, it's been a heck of a ride, and there's nothing to feel any remorse for. I think he came in and did his job. And if he wants to transition into a more of a front office role, I think that'd be fine, right? I think he, at a high level, understands the game well enough. There's just some specific areas where, at the or like I guess at the ice level, right? I think his feel of the game there has changed a lot. He kind of reiterated something that he said in an interview to The Athletic with Murata Tesh, is that, he wants to lose his way. And he said, he made decisions, and he does think that some of them, should have been called into question. He thinks that he, absolutely was responsible for what happened in the playoff series. But he said he's always made tough decisions, and he is going to continue to make them. And that, to me, kind of said, if, given how the players reacted and some of the stuff that they said at the end of the game directly after the end of the series, I sort of feel like this has been a bridge that can't be gapped, right? I think the Jets are going to, mutually agree to part ways with him as a head coach, but perhaps move him into more of a front office role. I think he can do some good there organizationally. I think that this would be a great way to hand over the reins to either Scott Arniel or another coach and start to push the Jets towards the future. Arniel as a head coach, I'm still not sure how I feel about that. I don't really have a great feel for what his tactical approach is like. There were some things that I liked immediately when he was running the bench earlier this year, but it's hard to know how much is his influence and how much of it was kind of him doing some continuity stuff with Rick Bowness. So we'll see how that goes. But I think the overall vibe is that, Bones is sort of telling us in so many words that this is probably, or this was his last season as head coach of the Jets. And I think this is a good natural point for him to hand over the reins. This was always a temporary arrangement. It wasn't really supposed to be a particularly long tenure as coach. And I think at the end of the day, when you look at where the Jets were and where he's left them, they're in a better position than they were when he walked in. And I think that's kind of all that he was ever asked to do. And I think he has done that. Like I said, fans are selling out the games again. The vibes and the news around the Jets and the media coverage was back to 2017, 2018 levels. I think this was the most enthusiasm we as fans had felt since that year, 6 seasons ago, man. That's been a long time. And if anything, I feel pretty hopeful for the future. I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. And some of that actually comes from not only some of his comments, but also some of the stuff the players were saying. I want to focus on a couple of key comments and also some guys who have expressed interest in maybe coming back and what their futures might be in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners from Monopoly Go. Game off, we got to pause here to talk more about Monopoly Go. I know what you're saying, flag on the play. You talked about Monopoly Go earlier already, but there's just so much good stuff in this game to chat about, and I really think you would love to download a great free twist on the hit classic. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for timed tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock. You can get everything from unique stickers that you can trade with friends to complete your albums, cool new playing pieces to travel the boards with, which, personally, I've always been a fan of the little dog I think that's my favorite piece. Tell me your favorite piece in the comments below. Or you can also get hilarious emojis to taunt your friends when you're smashing their buildings or stealing from their precious vaults. Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton include their own unique minigames like digging for treasure and a robot pachinko machine. There's always new timed events that help you win big prizes like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go, so get off the bench and go download it now free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on! Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are talking about some fun, fascinating stuff coming out of Winnipeg's end-of-season press conferences. Obviously, a lot of player interviews, some player statements. Bowness himself addressed the media and kind of, in so many words, I think hinted at stepping away from the bench at the conclusion of everything here this year. So lots of interesting takeaways. And it wasn't just Bowness who I think said some really fascinating stuff. We got really candid commentary from everyone from Hellebuyck to DeMelo to even Kyle Connor, who said some interesting stuff that I wasn't really expecting. I know that in some ways the comments from Ehlers are probably not going to be what people want to hear, but we'll dive into all of that in just a moment. Just wanted to let you know something really cool, though, that I think is probably worth spotlighting. If you're a Fox Sports or ESPN watcher and you have to turn down the volume because there's so much shouting, you should make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, player interviews are always one of those times where you get typically run-of-the-mill statements or just a lot of platitudes. I think almost from the get-go, you could tell that the tone this year was a little bit different. I think that there's a lot of bitterness and upset feelings over the way that the series ended, and not in a bad way necessarily, more like the Jets feeling like there's a lot of unfulfilled promise, and guys were, quite frankly, hungry to come back next season and really try and build on what the past 2 years have led to. And some of that interesting commentary kind of kicked off. We've had, of course, the captain talk, and we kind of walk through some of the big takeaways from the season. But I think some of the comments that really stuck out to me, one of the biggest ones came from Hellebuyck. He kind of, in so many words, said that, he had to change his mentality after this season because he kind of said, I can't do it all on my own. And he said he had to realize that and sort of reevaluate his approach to the game, which I think is fascinating because this is the first time I can ever remember where Hellebuyck has ever sort of implied that he needs more support. Traditionally, he's never really talked about the team in front of him lacking in some capacity. But I think this, and people have sort of talked about his, his mental health and how, his focus on it and some of the things that he's mentioned as part of his initiatives. This actually felt more like him saying that just period, he needs more support out there. And I think, I would certainly agree with that. The defense in this playoff series really struggled. I think in terms of, his own approach to the game, I don't know if that necessarily needs to change. Maybe part of it is just resting more during the regular season, more games for the backup, maybe some games off or more nights off. Could be. It's hard to know exactly what he was referring to. Maybe he was talking about needing to trust his teammates more and struggling with that. I don't know. But the general vibe I got was that for the first time, we really heard him talk about Winnipeg itself needing to make an adjustment and a change in the way it plays. But he reflected it through his own perspective, right? And sort of talked about that from his own game needing to change, which I thought was fascinating. I've never heard him say that before, not in the previous playoff series losses, stuff like that. I know he skipped out on the initial media availability directly following Game 5, but I feel like maybe if this is what he was waiting to kind of talk about and he just needed to collect his thoughts, I think this was a very good thing for him to do. I think it ended up leading to some really insightful commentary and really fascinating implications for how he views his role on this team and kind of stuff like that. He talked about having to expect to steal games, and maybe he feels like that mindset wasn't appropriate. That to him kind of says that he didn't trust his teammates and didn't think that the team was going to be good enough against Colorado, right? So fascinating there. Kyle Connor also alluded to the fact that he feels the team needed to make adjustments. He kind of said that, game 5, we had some good stuff going, but, at the end of the day, it was kind of too little too late. And he feels the team kind of needs to make more higher level tactical adjustments. And he didn't explicitly blast anyone, but I think in light of the comments that we've heard on and off the past week or so, it does kind of seem like players have pushed against the coaching staff's decisions and lineup changes. Even Scheifele earlier this week said, ahead of Game 5, we need to make changes. The Avs made their adjustments, and we didn't. And I think that was some of the most direct fire I've seen Bowness take from the players since last year. So all very interesting. To me, it kind of tells me that the players feel that a new voice is needed behind the bench. And, I certainly agree with that. But it's interesting that they've been very forthcoming about the need to perhaps move the team forward. And there was a sort of emphasis from Morrissey and a few others that this really showed them the gap between where the Jets are now and where they should be, which is fascinating because the Jets have played against Stanley Cup caliber opponents for years. They've played and lost to Cup finalists and Cup winners in the last several playoff appearances. So it's not like this is a particularly new phenomenon, and they're not facing teams who were below them or poor teams. Many of these teams that they faced ended up going on to have either deep playoff runs or even at some point win a cup. So, for the Jets, it shouldn't really be a new experience. And yet the way that they talked about it was like the first or second time they've ever had this happen. So interesting stuff. Maybe they're just being candid for the first time and really being, comfortable to speak up and say stuff, which tells me that there's more internal pressure to make some big changes this offseason. I think that is the overall vibe I'm getting. I think guys are tired of just running it back overall and making adjustments at the margins rather than addressing some of the biggest challenges and elephants in the room, which is interesting. Very, very interesting. It does give me a modicum of hope for the future. And there's one comment that I'm going to say for the last portion of the episode because it actually, for me, was perhaps the best news out of all of this and stuff that is really exciting for the future, especially next season. I think next season, I'm telling you, it's going to be a bit of a growing pain season, but I think we're going to start to see a team that looks more and more to what the Jets were several years ago when they made that fantastic cup run. The Jets, were fueled by youth. They had a good mixture of veterans and ELCs, and I think Winnipeg is going to start going back to that, which, listen, if they find the right coach behind the bench, I promise you it is going to be a great time. So, like I said, there are a couple of other guys who made some interesting comments specifically about their future with the Jets. Brendan Dillon and Dylan DeMelo have both expressed an interest in remaining. DeMelo just had his second kid. You should hear his joke about it. It was really funny and got the whole group laughing in the room. So great one. He's a guy who I think is going to be sort of a cornerstone of the locker room culture for the next several years. I think his contract extension is not going to be so much about money as it is just finding a place to stick around for the next 3 to 4 years. And look, he doesn't have to have the role aside Morrissey. In fact, I think it would be better if maybe he ate up less minutes because you can tell that he's slowing down, and I think it was a little hard for him to keep up. But he is still a really smart player, and if you bring him back, I think it'll end well for the Jets. Dillon, for me, it kind of depends on what his agent wants. I like Brendan a lot, and I think his game really grew in ways I didn't expect under Bones. Obviously, he's getting up there in years, and he plays a very punishing style. But if the Jets can find a way to not break the bank with his contract, I'm a lot more open to the idea of bringing him back. Supposing that you can figure out some way to move Schmidt and Pionk off the books, because the Jets do need that cap space. And, Dillon's probably going to need closer to a $5 million deal. So stuff to keep in mind going forward. But both guys definitely want to come back, and I'm pretty happy about that sort of feedback. Ehlers didn't really commit to the future, and I think that was not really a surprise. I think we all knew that this was probably coming. He said he needs to talk to his agent and talk with Chevy, and I could envision him requesting a trade this offseason. If we're really lucky and he's willing to give it one more shot with a new coaching staff, maybe this is like a last chance for the relationship to be salvaged. But he spent the bulk of his best years, being underutilized and underappreciated by almost every coach on this team. And I feel like it's unfortunate. I mean, for a guy who is so talented and who is so creative, it just feels like time and time again, the way that a lot of coaches are, and it's, admittedly a little old fashioned for most of them, it has led them to not see the way that he plays, how he creates space and time, and how impactful he is in the transition game. And he's become essentially a middle six player for the Jets, which he's just not. He's clearly good enough to play in your top six and be a key contributor. And yet the way that he's been treated by the coaching staff really has never reflected that. So really tough call there, but I think a trade's probably coming. I mean, unless he really sticks around next year and wants to give it one last shot before deciding on his future plans, I can't see this bridge being mended. But I'm open to things changing. Maybe next season heals the wounds if a coach kind of recognizes what they have in him and uses him more, but not feeling good about that. So, amidst all of the hope and promise, that is one thing that's probably not going to be something people are happy with. But I did allude to earlier there being some feedback from Chevy about players asking him about some stuff. And there's one particular comment about the youth that I think is really worth spotlighting because for me, like I said, it gave me a lot of optimism about the upcoming seasons. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But before we go any further, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. For those of you who are following the playoffs, obviously the Jets run is over. But you know what? There are plenty of other teams out there who are really going for it. And of course, the NBA is in essentially their finals form. So you're looking at some really tight playoff races. This is a very, very fun playoff run for both the NBA and NHL. There's a lot of surprise upsets in the works. I think there's some teams that a lot of people were not really expecting to do as well as they did, and some surprisingly early exits. If you want to take advantage of all of that, then, get in on the action with FanDuel because right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Hello, friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's closing thoughts as we are just wrapping up with some interesting feedback that Chevy mentioned. And I don't know if the players necessarily referred to this. I was kind of in and out of some of their player interviews, but apparently he got specifically asked by a couple of the vets about McGroarty, about Salamanson, Lambert, and Chibrikov, which I find to be incredibly fascinating. This is the first time I can recall, maybe ever, that Jets players specifically asked about prospects and guys they'd recently played with. The fact that it sounded like it was more than one player is intriguing to say the least, but it tells me that guys are kind of on the idea of incorporating more youth and getting younger and faster, which that's how the Jets of 2017, 2018 were built. And look, I know that this season felt like a huge kick to the junk. I mean, I'm still a little bit sore over it, but I think compared to previous years when the Jets were running it back, this is one of those playoff exits where I felt pretty okay. I wouldn't say at peace 100%, but I felt okay with the direction and future of the team. I think Winnipeg was trying to squeeze out the last drops from this remaining core, and I think they got about as far as they could. But I think now they've seen that the philosophical change and the need for speed that we've kind of been talking about for a few years now is almost a priority for this offseason. And the fact that they specifically talked about a couple of players who were, NHL debutants at the end of the regular season tells me that they're ready to start welcoming them in. And I think that is a fantastic change. You don't really hear this from the Jets all that often. So when they do say something like this, it gives me a lot of optimism. This tells me that not only do they want more youth incorporated, but they also want a coach who's willing to play them and give them the right role. And if that's the case, maybe they're also thinking about Perfetti here too. Cole was very underused, and I think he didn't really get a fair shake under Bones, and I think that's really going to change with the next coach. Arneal already was more partial to him, especially late in games, so that's positive if Arneal gets hired. But I think somebody who's got more progressive offensive ideas and who's willing to lean into that identity change, being a faster, more mobile team, that to me is really exciting. And the fact that Salamonson also came up is very, very interesting because he had a very interesting camp where he was one of the more exciting D prospects and, very clearly showed why this year in the SHL, he was one of his team's top defenders. He became their de facto number 1D and was playing like 24 minutes a night. So I think he might be closer to an NHL role than people realize. Obviously, the jump from Sweden to North America is a bigger gap than it used to be. But Salamonson might be kind of in that Heinola tier where, the time it takes him to adapt to this level of hockey might be faster than people expect. I wouldn't be shocked if Salamonson actually makes a bottom pairing role or something out of camp this year, pending how he looks, right? Maybe he needs some time with the Moose early on just to get up to speed, but I do think, sooner than later, we're going to see him at the NHL level. So there's a lot to really be intrigued by there. McGroarty could be an interesting one insofar as, maybe the Jets sort of revisit his decision to go back to Michigan next year, this offseason, especially if they start cutting some bait with some of their current contracts and maybe freeing up space. Maybe there's a spot that ends up opening up for him either at the start of the offseason or more towards, the trade deadline and stuff as they prepare to, welcome him in if he decides to go back to Michigan and definitely plays there, after his quest for a title ends. Then he signs and joins the Jets. So there's a lot of really, really intriguing stuff here. What I'll say at the end of all of this is that I feel much more positive about the direction the Jets are starting to move than I felt in years past. I think the Jets are cognizant of what's wrong with the team, and I think that they want to change. The fact that they've repeatedly called for adjustments now, to me, says that they know where their weak, their primary weaknesses are. It's speed and skill, and they seem like they're ready to address that. If the vets are buying into this, that can only be a good thing because it means that they're ready to change their mindset going forward. I think the leadership on this team is ready to move forward, and I think that should be exciting for all of us. I know that, again, we're still used to the Jets being stuck in their ways, but I do think that this is going to be the first, the upcoming season is going to be the first time in a long time when we're going to start to see the recent fruits of Winnipeg's drafts really come to fruition. I do think Chibrikov and Lambert are going to be on the team next year. I think Salamonson has a shot to make it. McGroarty may too if he decides to perhaps rethink his college plans. And we'll see if any of the other Moose players like Reichel or guys like that who have kind of been journeyman players but have done really well in their roles maybe fight for a spot too. Dashevsky is still out there overseas and perhaps could be an outside shot to come back. Barlow, I think with an off-season of development, could be interesting. He still looks to be probably the furthest off of Winnipeg's prospects, but we'll give him some time and see what he looks like. And I think, you never want to leave out Chaz Lucius, even though I do think that his pro career is probably more on the outs than it is, on the rise. So keep an eye out for him. I think a lot of people said the same stuff about Velarde. I do think with Lucius, he's had a few more injuries than Velarde did, and I do kind of worry about Lucius's upper body, integrity. He's had some really nasty stuff, and it really sucks because he is a supreme talent, and it'd be a shame if his pro career got derailed before it ever really got going. So we'll have to see how that shakes out, but all I want to say is I think going forward, the Jets have some really intriguing talent coming through the pipelines, and I think it's going to be in the NHL sooner rather than later. So get excited. Brad Lambert showed us flashes of the future. Chibrikov scored his NHL debut first goal in his first game, and it was an absolute peach of a snipe. There's just a lot to like. Maybe Chibrikov actually becomes our Logan Stankoven. If you look at how the Stars were built this year, they had tons of young guys forcing their way into the lineup. Maybe, just maybe, the Jets have the same thing brewing, man. If they do, I promise you, this team next year is going to be a lot of fun. Overhaul the defense, look for a progressively minded coach, and kind of get the ball rolling, because I promise you this team is going to have a much more fun season and start to point towards looking more like Colorado in the future. But for tonight's episode, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making us your first listen of the day every day. Tomorrow, we'll focus more on playoff updates and seeing how some of our other competitors and teams are doing in their chase for the Stanley Cup Finals. But like I said, that's all the time that we have tonight. As always, thanks so much for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets go.